Since it was introduced in about 1928, the double wedding ring has been a constant favorite, but it is for the advanced piecer. To make it available to less seasoned piecers, many authors have developed templates, paper piecing, and alternative methods for construction, but it remains difficult. My good friend used to sew with me a few times a week and managed to piece partial blocks each time. Her project is 14 years old and only 2/3 of the way to the piece top, let alone quilted. My inexperienced daughter managed to construct one with the directions and templates from the book Rings That Bind, which I believe is the easiest method for people who do not own an embroidery machine. But now Anita Gooddesign's anniversary quilt collection includes embroidery files for folded fabric piecing and wonderful quilted feathers that make success attainable even for the beginner and machine embroiderers. The brother Quattro, or its twin, the baby lock Elissimo, have the perfect 8-inch hoop for the largest size files included in Anita Gooddesign's anniversary quilt collection. You will need some basic embroidery supplies: a soft cutaway mesh stabilizer like OESD's poly mesh or Floriani's no-sew nylon hooped in the square frame, something to add body to your fabric like starch or water-soluble stabilizer, something to hold your fabric pieces in place like 505 spray, Floriani low residue pink tape, blue painter's tape, quilter's basting glue, or strips of water-soluble sticky stabilizer. Bobbins filled with bobbin thread. It took about 1/3 of a 100-yard pre-wound 78 weight by 2-ply bobbin for each block. Spools of embroidery thread. I only use 2 colors of isocord thread. An embroidery scissors designed for trimming in the hoop. Cotton batting cut into 7 3/4 inch squares. Cotton fabric, the base fabric cut 9 1/2 inch square, and 12 2 1/2 inch squares of printed fabric per block. These are laid down in pairs, so you may want to use just 6 prints or make it scrappy with different prints for each section of the ring. I use 2 different prints for the kite corners of the rings. Although the embroidery design indicate many thread changes, you do not change your thread that often. I only use 2 colors of thread. All of the other colors are only there to tell your machine to stop for you to either lay down the applique fabric or trim the fabric to fit. Stitch out, step 1. This is the placement stitch, and the stop is for you to place your piece of batting. If you use 505 spray, you can position a perfectly cut piece of batting within this square and skip over the tacking stitch for the batting. If the batting is not perfectly pre-cut, place it, tack it down, remove the hoop from the machine but not the fabric from the hoop, and carefully trim the batting very close to the tack down stitch. The next stitch is the placement line for the background fabric, followed by the tack down stitch for the background fabric. Then another stop for you to trim the background fabric from the areas under the rings. Trimming this area will keep your blocks from getting too bulky in the kite corners. It is very important that you do not trim away the seam allowance from the outside edge of your block. Now the wonderful feather quilt pattern will be stitched. This is the first time I changed the thread color to the teal blue. This thread color remains my thread of choice through all of the placement lines, the seam lines, the tack down stitches, and the arch satin stitch. The next stitch is the placement line for the first pair of fabrics for the rings. These are stitched as applique with just the placement line followed by the tack down stitch. Secure your fabric so it stays flat over the placement line for stitching. Then trim the pair of rings applique. You are now ready for the second pair of placement stitches. Once they are in place, the next pair of 2 1/2 inch squares need to be placed upside down with the edges matching the trimmed edge of the previous block. This is very similar to paper piecing. The machine will stitch a perfect seam. It is now time for you to take extra care. Finger press this fabric down to cover the placement stitch and be very flat. Secure it so that as the embroidery machine does its stitching, the presser foot cannot get caught under the edge of the fabric and pull or fold that fabric out of place. If you make the mistake of not properly securing the fabric, it will be time to dig out the seam ripper. Trim the excess fabric close to the final tack down of this pair of blocks. With the second pair of blocks in place, the machine will stitch the placement line for the next pair of blocks and stop for you to lay the third pair of fabric for the seam line. After the seam is stitched again, carefully finger press the piece to cover the placement stitch and secure it so it stays in place as the tack down stitch is stitched. Carefully trim the fabric next to the tack down stitch. This folded fabric process is repeated 4 times. When you have trimmed the last of these arches, it will stitch the satin stitch, which covers all of the arch's raw edges. With the satin stitch complete, it now stitches a vine quilting stitch down the center of the arches. For the vine, I changed the thread to a pale yellow. This is the 20th stop in the design, but only the 2nd time I have changed the thread. Following the vine quilting is a time to place the fabric for the kite corners. These are applique technique with a placement stitch, followed by a tack down stitch, and a stop for trimming the fabric. Warning: unlike all of the arch pieces that were in the block's interior, these 2 pieces are in the corners next to seam line. Do not trim the seam allowance. With the corner kites trimmed along the arches, their satin stitch will sew out, followed by a final quilting stitch of a flower in each kite. The stitching for 1 block is now done. Remove it from the hoop and use the interior stitch line to trim the seam allowance to 1/2 inch. Trim the stabilizer away from the seam allowance. Assemble these blocks together in just a matter of lining up the seam line on the blocks and stitching just inside those lines. Take care when matching the corners of each block and the satin stitches. The piece top is completely quilted, so all you need to do is add a backing to cover up the back side. I find that using the button sew-on stitch built into this machine and matching embroidery thread, I can tack the layers together inconspicuously over design elements and quickly. This is the best wedding ring I've ever sewn, and it is done only a week after I began, not 14 years and holding. Good luck with yours.